Hello.
So we are very pleased to have today with us in our Bar-Ilan University Vision Science Seminar Professor Halely Balaban from the Department of Education and Psychology at the Open University. Dr. Balaban did her BA and MA at an exceptionally distinguished direct-to-MA program, the Adi Lautman Interdisciplinary Program for Outstanding Students at Tel Aviv University. Her master's was in cognitive psychology at the School of Psychological Sciences at Tel Aviv University under the supervision of Professor Ro'i Luria. She then continued to do a PhD at the Sagol School of Neuroscience in Tel Aviv University with the supervision of Professor Luria. She did her postdoc at MIT with Professor Josh Tenenbaum, where she also collaborated and is still collaborating with Professor Tomer Ullman from Harvard. A couple of years ago, she joined the Open University's Department of Education and Psychology, where she leads the Cognitive Dynamics and Adaptability Lab, or CDA in short. She publishes in top leading journals as Nature Communications, Trends in Cognitive Sciences, JEP General, Journal of Neuroscience, and more. She seeks to understand how humans create, maintain, and transform flexible mental representations of dynamic information with regards to physical objects in visual scenes. Specifically, she's interested in how mental representations can and why they sometimes cannot change to reflect changes in the objects around us, how humans make intuitive predictions and judgments about these objects, and how the two processes interact. Her lab uses a variety of tools from cognitive neuroscience, such as EEG, behavioral measures, and computational modeling. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Haleli, to our seminar to hear about your exciting research, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for the kind invitation and very kind words. I'll try to share my screen and tell me if it works. Okay. Let's see. Is that okay? Okay, perfect.
Works fine.
Thank you. So again, thank you so much, and I'll just dive right into it. We live in a very hectic world. The things we see constantly move, change, and interact, and this creates a great challenge. So how does our cognitive system handle dynamic visual information in a way that's efficient, flexible, and reliable? This question is currently studied by two largely independent research traditions. The first is working memory, which examines how we hold relevant information in an active state. And I will also call this online processing to emphasize that active maintenance is relevant not only for memory. Obviously, working memory as our online workspace is very important for ongoing function, which is clear from the strong connections it has with, for example, fluid intelligence and how it is damaged in different situations from normal aging to schizophrenia. And researchers usually study working memory with simplified, highly controlled analogs of this need for active information processing. So for example, in the change detection task, people are asked to memorize stimuli over a short interval and then indicate whether one of them changed. And the overwhelmingly replicated finding is that people can only hold a very limited amount of information in this active state. There are important ongoing debates regarding the precise nature of these capacity limits, but what is clear is that not all of the perceptual information can be stored in working memory, creating obviously a bottleneck for our cognition. Aside from the limited capacity, a key aspect of working memory is the active nature of its representations. So numerous studies have shown that they can be modified to reflect changes in the item's features or their grouping cues. And another important example is the ability to update the locations of moving items, which is seen in tasks like multiple object tracking, where many identical items are shown. Some are briefly highlighted as targets, and then all of them start to move. And participants are asked to track the targets for a while so that they can indicate at the end whether a specific item was a target. And here too, performance dramatically declines as we add more items. This means that there is a limit not only to the amount of information that we can store in working memory, but also to the ability to modify these representations. Sorry. So aside from the limited contents of working memory, there is also the question of how their updating is enabled. And logically, if we represent an item in working memory and it changes, we must have a way of accessing the correct representation and in working memory and change it. And this requires some form of a stable mapping between each representation and a specific part of the perceptual input, which we will refer to by the sort of general name of a pointer system. This idea was first suggested in the context of multiple object tracking, where we must hold on to items as they move. They're all identical aside from location, and location constantly changes as well. But the same logic applies to non-spatial types of updating. So here, not only can the car move, but its lights can go on, which is a featural change. So every type of change requires a way of tracking and accessing working memory representations. And pointers are currently discussed as the infrastructure of working memory, also beyond the spatial context for any type of representational updating. And it's important to note that the pointer-based mapping is both theoretically and empirically distinct from the contents of working memory. So we have working memory, and the second, more recent tradition to study dynamic processing is the study of intuitive physics. So while formal physics is challenging and very effortful, humans have a common sense intuition of physics, allowing us to understand the dynamics of inanimate objects around us, which is, of course, critical in handling a complex environment, for example, for action selection. And one aspect of that is that we expect things to behave in certain ways. We make very strong intuitive predictions about how objects should move, how stable something is, whether one thing can pass through another, and so on. And this structured set of expectations is not only shared by everyone here today, but also by non-human animals and pre-verbal infants, which we know mainly from the violation of expectation paradigm. So, for example, when babies are shown a puppet, which is then hidden behind a screen, and another puppet is added, they look longer if when the screen lowers, there's only one puppet as compared to two. And if we start with two puppets and one is removed behind the screen, they look longer when two puppets are shown at the end than when only one is shown. Meaning that here, 5-month-old babies look longer at the outcome that we would consider impossible, suggesting that they have some expectation about object permanence. And many, many other studies reported similar results for other core knowledge principles. Now, from these basic expectations of how objects behave, there's the question of how people reason about specific dynamics. So classic studies describe people's biases in physical judgments. For example, by having them solve diagram problems here regarding the trajectory of a ball going out of a tube, and finding that they pretty often stray from ground truth physics. And so researchers argue that we rely on perhaps a naive pre-Newtonian theory of physics or maybe heuristics. But in the past decade and a half, the field gained new interest when the approach shifted to modeling different aspects of reasoning over more realistic stimuli. So, for example, studies present a scene like this and ask participants to make judgments of different sorts, like how heavy is the ball or whether the tower is stable. And with this kind of ecological setting, people indeed sometimes make mistakes, but can generally solve these problems well. And the challenge for proposed algorithms is to systematically capture both the successes and failures. And for this aim, the computations often deliberately stray from precise physics, for example, in terms of adding perceptual noise or using approximate equations. So we have two very fruitful traditions that tackle dynamic information processing from two almost opposite directions. In working memory, researchers used control and validated tasks to show how people manage to store information in an active state and update representations when things change. but also that storage and manipulation are limited in their capacity. And to reveal these capacity limits, researchers have to use simple arbitrary stimuli like colored squares, because otherwise people can rely on compensation mechanisms such as long-term memory or grouping. And this was necessary, but obviously the real world does have important regularities, and these capacity limit systems are quite likely to take advantage of them. And in common sense physics, on the other hand, researchers use realistic scenes and manage to examine the underlying computations, which are approximate, and competing models differ in the approximations they make, but they are generally not restricted to what can be considered cognitively plausible in terms of capacity limits, which seems important because the limit on working memory's ability to handle dynamic information might be very relevant here. I see that Yafa is raising her hand. Yafa, do you want to ask a question?
No, it reacts to my hands moving, I
Oh,
guess. I didn't
sorry.
press any key. Sorry.
Okay. Um, Given that both working memory and intuitive physics deal with the issue of dynamic information processing, could there be a connection between them? So here I will try to ask two questions. Do the capacity limits of online processing play some part in how we can perform physical tasks? And do basic physical expectations affect the infrastructure of online processing? And I will argue that the answer to both questions is yes, and that this uncovers a very deep connection between physics and working memory. So let's start with the first question. Do the capacity limits of visual online processing have some influence on common sense physical reasoning? As I mentioned before, a basic question in common sense physical reasoning is what computations support them. And one of the most influential ideas in recent years is that of mental physical simulation. So if we see a scene like this and we try to determine what will happen next, we might do something like construct a simplified representation of the scene in our mind and then move the scene forward in our imagination based on some algorithms. And central to this view is that it's approximate, both in terms of the representations. You can see that it doesn't really care about fine sort of shape details or texture, but only coarse object structure. And it's approximate also in terms of the calculations that bring us from one time step to the next. So the computation isn't perfectly aligned with physics, and this saves on computational resources. The idea draws inspiration from the way engineers solve a similar problem in video games or animations, where a specialized module called a physics engine takes a coarse scene representation and performs step-by-step approximate simulation on of the dynamics of movement, collisions, and so on. So the simulation makes the physics in the game sort of feel realistic, but it doesn't solve the full precise physical equations. It's sort of a good enough approach. With very cheap computations, we get fairly realistic results. And the mental simulation approach has been shown to account for how people make predictions about the physical future in a variety of contexts, like determining whether the tower is stable or in what direction it might fall, and also questions that are further removed. So how might such a simulation be realized? If we're transforming mental representations, a natural candidate would be working memory. But in these studies, scenes often have many, many objects, and the models move all of them together, meaning that they have no capacity limit. In contrast, as we know, working memory research shows that we're generally limited in storing representations and updating them, and we're even more limited when things are not entirely visible. So people are imprecise when resolving occlusion in tracking tasks, for example, and for unoccluded items, they usually would not extrapolate their trajectory. They would not spontaneously predict where they will be next, or they do so in a very limited way. So how can we reconcile these two sort of opposite views? Is intuitive physics capacity unlimited, as is currently assumed by the models, meaning it is some special case that likely relies on something other than working memory, maybe because it's so basic for our everyday cognition? Or is it actually limited in its capacity and current physical reasoning studies were somehow unsuited for revealing this? So as a first step towards solving this question, we will try to measure here how many objects people can simulate at once. So to estimate the capacity limits of mental simulation, we developed this novel task where we showed participants animations of physical scenes and asked them to press a key when each ball hits the ground. But instead of seeing the actual impact time, the scenes paused mid-motion and participants were told to continue the animation in their mind's eye and press the key when the ball in their imagination hits the ground. Our goal was to compare mental simulation with what actually happens in the world, and we do this using timing. I'll say a bit more about that later. So we created the scenes using a physics engine, meaning that they are aligned with physics perceptually. And the physics engine also gave us the ground truth measure of when each event would have happened. And we can compare that with the timing of events in people's imagination, which we estimate using their response time. So to get a feeling of the task, although we can't do the interactive version via Zoom, I'll show the animation again. You can try to continue the motion in your mind's eye and sort of try to find the moment when you think the ball in your imagination hits the ground. So I'll just show it once again. And this is the task. It's supposed to be a clap task, but we'll forget about it. So to make sure people can do the task well, the first group of subjects did a task with a single ball, which could appear on either the left or right, and it moved toward the center, either like a cannonball or in a collision path with the wall, but the collision isn't seen given how early the animations pause. And these two movement types were also associated with different colors to make the task a bit easier. We independently manipulated the height and velocity to create 4 different impact times for each ball in steps of 200 milliseconds. And this appears on the x-axis, time 0 being when the animations pause and the simulation can begin. And subjective impact time is on the y-axis. What we find for our participants is a very clear linear trend with increased impact time, response time increases, meaning people are very sensitive to these tiny differences in ground truth physics. And this is true also at the individual participant level for almost everyone. So with a single object, people can continue a physical trajectory in imagination very accurately, as is predicted by models of mental simulation. But now the question is, can simulation handle more than a single object? So we can present 2 objects in each animation and ask participants to press a different key for each ball. What will happen next? It depends exactly on the number of objects people can simulate at once. So for predictions, we built 2 computational models that simulate the objects using the same physics engine that generated the stimuli. And we examined the model-based impact time for each ball. One option is that mental simulation is parallel and moves both objects in tandem. And the parallel model predicts that the responses to both objects are very close together, only modulated by the actual impact time. And this is what current models of common sense physical reasoning assume. But it could also be that mental physical simulation is limited to a single object and so must work serially. Meaning that imagination moves one ball until it hits the ground and only then sort of unfreezes the second ball and moves it until it hit the ground as well. And if that's the case, then there should be a large difference between the responses. The first response, which represents the first simulation, is fine. But then the second response is much slower because the simulation of the second ball must wait for the first simulation to end before it can even start. So let's get a feeling of the task again. We'll see animations with 2 objects. They will pause, and you can try to continue the movement in your mind's eye and mark to yourself when each ball hits the ground. Okay? We can see it once more. Okay, so the 2 objects task is the main reason we use timing as our measure instead of something like asking participants to mark where the ball would hit. So not only do the models make very different predictions for the simulation duration, but just pressing 2 different keys means we're not imposing a serial response pattern. So our second group of participants did a two objects task, and we look at the subjective impact time by the true impact time again, and also break down the responses by order, first key press versus the second. So the first response is fine, but the second response is where the models actually differ. So if simulation is parallel for two objects, the second response should be very close to the first. But if it's serial, then we should find a gap. And indeed, there's this huge delay, and the results align almost perfectly with the serial model's predictions. I'll just say, then one can also think of serial simulation that switches back and forth between the objects. We tested that as well, and turns out it totally deviates from people's responses. I'll be very happy to show the results later if you have any questions. So we can also examine the delay between the responses as a function of the actual difference between the impact times of each ball. In the parallel model, both simulations happen at once. So with a 0 difference, there will be basically no delay. With a 200 milliseconds difference, the second simulation still has 200 milliseconds left, and so on. So the parallel prediction is an intercept of 0 and a slope of 1. In the serial model, the true difference doesn't matter at all because the second simulation must start from scratch anyway. And therefore, the prediction is a slope of 0, and the intercept is just the average simulation duration, which here it was 800 milliseconds. So participants' results very nicely follow the serial model's predictions, and this flat serial pattern can be seen in the individual data sets of almost all participants. So with as little as two objects, mental physical simulation follows the serial model's predictions, meaning its capacity limit is just one object. Aside from the need to simulate two trajectories, though, our task also required participants to respond to each object on each trial. So could the serial pattern reflect these response requirements? I should say that in the experiment, response mapping was very easy. Participants pressed a different key for each ball based on spatial mapping. So left side key for left side ball and right side key for right side. But maybe the bottleneck was because of the response itself. So our third group of participants saw the same animations with two objects and pressed the keys when they hit the ground. But now the animations play all the way through. There's no simulation component, but the response requirements are the same. So if the serial pattern reflects response, we should replicate it here. But if it's about mental simulation, then here we should get a parallel pattern. And now we see that indeed the second response is very close to the first. So we don't have a serial pattern when there's no need to mentally simulate the trajectories, meaning that the bottleneck isn't response requirements. But is this seriality specific to these complex motion paths and the need to calculate realistic physical dynamics? We try to push the serial claim to an extreme by replacing the falling object with a very simplified scenario similar to classic tracking tasks, where there are two disks moving in straight lines towards the edges of the screen. And the task for our final group of subjects was simply to say when each of them reaches the edge. This is as simple as it gets, but even here, we got a huge serial cost, meaning that the single object limit is not about complex physical calculations, but any type of precise mental simulation. So here in this work, we examined the capacity to mentally simulate the movement of physical objects. And we found that people can simulate only a single object at a time in their mind's eye. So with a single object, simulation was in line with the underlying physics, just like models of physical simulation predict. But adding just one more object caused a huge delay between the responses, which was perfectly in line with the predictions of a serial simulation model. The serial pattern wasn't due to response requirements and was found even for simple, minimally physical simulation. So we find that mental simulation works serially, moving a single object before turning to the next. Meaning not only is mental simulation very limited, unlike what intuitive physics models currently assume, but the capacity limit is much smaller than the 3 to 4 item limit of storing or tracking representations in working memory. But this aligns very nicely with some recent suggestions of a one object limit in motion extrapolation, and also with the claim from working memory research that we have a focus of attention that takes a single item at a time of the entire workspace and updates only that item. Of course, these findings open up questions of how we manage our everyday environment, which is way more complex than our simplified task. Though I should note that usually we don't have to catch two balls at a time, but only one. But just like any research on capacity limits, you can think of like change blindness or things like that. In everyday life, we probably have compensation mechanisms. So intuitive physics is so basic, and it sometimes have specialized hacks or shortcuts for problems that repeat. So, for example, when things are with things piled on top of each other, like the tower of blocks, we might follow like a single summary statistics, like the center of mass, for example. And we are currently working on figuring out situations of interactions between items, like collisions. So do people manage to use parallel simulation, or do they have to still simulate serially using, for example, a distance between items, or use a serial model that switches between the items, or maybe something else altogether? And these questions and the initial answers from the current studies are part of this broader quest for describing the hidden capacity limits of mental simulation. Obviously, our ability to correctly predict the future is critical for how we understand the world and interact with it, but even something as basic as intuitive physics might be limited by online processing and its capacity limits. So common sense physical reasoning is under severe capacity limits, and this sort of makes sense given that the computations necessary for such precise prediction might happen in working memory within a single object focus of attention. And here's a link to the paper if you would like to see more experiments or models or anything else. But what about the other way around? So physical prediction might be realized in working memory, but do the basic expectations of intuitive physics have any direct influence on fully developed adult cognition, even when people don't engage in explicit physical judgments? So aside from triggering overt surprise when they are violated, do physical expectations shape how we handle the world? Some behavioral studies suggested that intuitive physics is relevant for the online maintenance and manipulation of visual information, but the results are mixed. So, for example, when people try to track multiple moving items, performance is better when items move according to realistic physics, and also generally better when targets move like rigid objects than like a fluid. But it was also found that violations of physical expectations like rigidity or coherence do not directly harm tracking performance, and instead people seem to be sensitive to the low-level motion dynamics associated with fluid-like movement. So one reason for the sort of ambiguous results might be that the task performance shows the end result of different processing stages. Here we have a perception and attention and encoding and maintenance and comparison and response selection and so on. And these different processes could pull in different directions. So how can we isolate online processing specifically? One approach is to record EEG while people perform a working memory task and measure event-related potentials, ERPs. So in a change detection task, for example, if people try to hold a colored square in mind, we see this activity, which sustains also during that 1 second when people are only trying to remember the item and see nothing on screen. And this ERP component is called the contralateral delay activity, the CDA. Its activity rises with the number of items we have in working memory. So amplitude for 2 items is higher than 1, and 3 is higher than 2. But when we go past 3, which is the average capacity in the population, the amplitude doesn't rise anymore. Sorry. So this means that the rise is specific to items that are actually in working memory. And this plateau in amplitude is correlated with individual working memory capacity. The better your working memory is, the higher the CDA will continue to rise. Importantly, many studies validated the CDA as a unique marker of working memory, and we know now that it doesn't reflect any of a number of related but distinct factors like perceptual processing. As a side, that's because the CDA is actually a contra-IPSI difference wave, like the N2PC. The CDA is also insensitive to response-related factors because we stop recording when the test array appears, so anything following working memory processing cannot influence the waveforms. And the CDA was shown not to reflect things like spatial attention, task difficulty, and so on. While the CDA was originally used in classic working memory paradigms, critically for us, it can be measured equally well when items are present on screen as long as they are retained in this active way in visual working memory, for example, in tracking tasks or visual search. And as any ERP component, the CDA's excellent temporal resolution allows us to measure changes in processing dynamics. So to ask whether and how online processing is affected by physics, by intuitive physics, we use the CDA in two different ways to isolate each of the two aspects of online processing that we mentioned before. So we have the contents of working memory and the pointer system mapping. So to examine the representational content of working memory, we rely on the classic set size effect, and we compare different conditions to see how many objects are represented in each of them. And that's the sort of the usual way of using the CDA, which is indeed a marker for the contents of working memory. But what about the pointers? So recently we showed that the CDA can also uncover the dynamics of the pointer system, but to do so, we have to manipulate the pointers. And specifically, in our research, we try to invalidate them. So the idea is that without a stable mapping, working memory cannot update its representations because there's no way to access them. So instead of updating, there's a process we call resetting. Working memory removes the original representations and starts anew. And one way to, so just as an example, one way to destroy the mapping, this sort of the correspondence between working memory representations and the items in the world, is to have an object split in two. And the idea is that before the split, people likely represent a single object, meaning there's a single mapping to support that representation. And after the split, there are two independent halves, none of which matches the original representation, which sort of ruins the mapping. This correspondence problem should trigger a resetting process, which leaves traces on the CDA, but I'll start with the behavior first. So we ask participants to attend to moving shapes like this. And Zoom isn't great for this, but you may or may not have noticed that something was strange about this. So I'll show it once again. Maybe you saw it now. So participants did a task that we call online change detection because there's no interval where items disappear. So they see moving items and indicate whether there was a change in shape. Actually, it's only in one half during the movement. And the change is very salient. So without the split, the task is really trivial. If the idea of pointers hold, then messing up the mapping between the object in the world and its working memory representation should lead to a short time when there's no way to compare them properly. So we predicted that a change in the features that happens right at the moment of the split might go unnoticed. We manipulated the time in which the change could have happened, either right at the moment of separation or 200 milliseconds before, after the split as sort of baselines. And you can see that without the split, performance is very high. It's basically at ceiling. Detecting these changes is very, very easy. But when the object splits in two, people largely miss these very salient changes in shape that happen right in front of their eyes, but only if the change happens sort of coincides with the separation. And just so it's clear, this isn't a sort of a surprise catch trial. People encounter the change with the separation dozens of times and still we get this effect. And if we help people to create a different mapping for each half even before the split, like here by drawing this very thin frame around each half, that's enough to make the cost smaller. So we see that specifically without a valid mapping, the representations are inaccessible, fitting this idea of resetting. But what about the CDA in these situations? So in those same cases where the mapping between working memory representations and the objects in the world gets messed up, and there's this resetting process when people are blind to salient changes, we also see a transient drop in CDA amplitude in line with the removal of unmapped representations. This CDA drop is present only when the pointers are compromised and not in highly similar situations that still allow the mapping to hold. For example, when it's easy to track each half independently even before the split. And it is also important to stress that the drop doesn't reflect general surprise either. It survives hundreds of repetitions and even happens for events that are perfectly predictable. So we want to measure the CDA in situations that violate intuitive physics to ask two questions. How are scenes reinterpreted after such violations, and whether the violations disrupt the pointer system ongoing ability to sort of track objects. So we took developmentally inspired animations of items crossing a stage behind an occluder that comes up and down, and we embedded them in a feature working memory task for adults so that we can measure the CDA. Before we test violations, let's just make sure we actually have a meaningful CDA for complex scenes because that has never been done before. So here I'll show you only possible events of a single object moving behind an occluder or two objects sort of crossing. CD amplitude will be on the y-axis. The more information we have in working memory, the higher the amplitude will be. And time is on the x-axis, 0 being the moment when the items first presented on screen. And this dashed line is when the objects start to exit from behind the occluder. And in gray, we have the analyzed time windows in all experiments. So first for any potential resetting drop effects, and then the final representation window where we compare the set size during the retention. So what happens for animations of possible physical events? We see a very nice CDA and even a set size effect, meaning that the CDA is sensitive to the way the scene is interpreted and represented in working memory, even for these relatively complex dynamics. But now we can add impossible events. Specifically here, we used violations of object permanence. So we have create, which starts with one object, but then two come out. So one is sort of magically added. And vanish starts with two objects, but only one comes out. So an object is magically removed. These violations also change the set size, which is great for the CDA. And critically, the task isn't about the events, but about the features of the object. So the physics here is irrelevant to the task. What are the predictions? The events are extremely non-salient because of the occluder. So if tracking and the pointer system are sort of low-level mechanisms that rely on strong perceptual cues, as is usually assumed, we shouldn't see a resetting effect in any condition. But if the pointer system tracking takes the physics of the scene into account, then we might find a resetting drop after the violations. So what we see is that we do get a sustained resetting drop in the create condition, and we also see a drop in the vanish condition. And eventually, working memory represents the correct number of objects in both cases, so an object is properly added or removed. And this pattern suggests that the pointer system cares about violations of object permanence, meaning it is sensitive to intuitive physics. And again, it can't be about simple surprise because dozens of exposures don't make the effect go away. So the fact that we have resetting when an object magically disappears shows that it's not about salient events. This condition doesn't even involve something that happened, only something that should have happened but didn't. And the fact that we have resetting following magical creation suggests that it really is about the physics of the scene because nothing happened to the tracked object, just a new one appeared where it shouldn't have. But is it really an effect of expectations? So to test this, we ran another experiment where everything was the same, except that we added this very small black rectangle behind the occluder in the create and vanish conditions. And we told participants that this is a hole in the floor, which objects can climb out of or fall into. So now the violations are explained away. But the occluder hides the events, so the visual input during the critical time is identical to the previous experiment. And this also makes create and vanish predictable, but we will soon see that that turns out not to be the critical factor here. So what are the predictions now? We already know that intuitive physics does affect online processing, but why? If the influence of physics is mediated by visual information or simply reflects a specific disruption to spatiotemporal continuity, the effect should be the same as in the previous experiment because these factors were identical. But if what disrupted the pointer system really was high-level physical expectations, then here we should find a smaller effect, at least for the vanish condition, where the explanation is just better due to gravity. So we indeed get a smaller effect for create, and for vanish, there is nothing. So even for events that are identical in low-level visual information and spatiotemporal continuity, what determines if they disrupt tracking is whether or not they obey high-level physical expectations. And you may have noticed that for the vanish condition, the amplitude at the end of the trial stays the same as for two objects. So people go on representing an object that they know in advance will disappear and is never probed at test. This rules out predictability as a driving factor. Otherwise, why even bother representing that object in the first place? But it makes a lot of sense in terms of the physical explanation given to the scene, because nothing happened to that other object, it just fell down. So what we did here is we used a validated EEG marker of online processing in this novel way, and we showed that intuitive physics directly shapes online processing in terms of both of how objects are tracked by the pointer system and how events are represented. The currency of the pointer system involves physical objects in a strong sense. Violations of intuitive physics disrupt tracking even for events that are extremely non-salient and for aspects of the scene that the task didn't require representing. And this wasn't the result of just violation of spatiotemporal continuity. Both pointers and the representations that rely on them are directly influenced by high-level physical explanations of events. And in light of these results, we can sort of reinterpret all of the events that were previously shown to trigger resetting as physical violations. For example, an object splitting, in fact, violates coherence and solidity. And today we're trying to figure out what other types of expectations mess up the pointers and which expectations do not interact with the pointer system and how that might be related to the developmental trajectory of these expectations. So the physical story might explain why there are so many object-based effects in visual working memory, because its infrastructure relies on intuitive predictions about the physics of objects. And this makes a lot of sense when considering the predictability of objects, which sort of removes so many options that are simply impossible for an object and allow the system to save on their computations. So we saw that intuitive physics restricts and guides online visual processing. And if you're interested in the paper, here's a link. And this puts forward a new view of the pointer system as physics-driven. And together, the findings suggest a bidirectional connection between intuitive physics and online visual processing. And I believe this reflects a shared core between them. A large portion of both these fields is devoted to handling dynamic objects. And so in a way, they solve the same problem and therefore are likely to work together somehow. More generally, given how important objects are in the real world, intuitive physics, as our ability to deeply understand them, is something that might be inherently involved in much more of our cognition than is usually assumed. So we can think about it through the engineered solution of how, for example, video games are currently developed. It works through a game engine where we can create a scene, say of a pile of oranges we throw an apple at. And the physics engine that we mentioned is the module within the game engine that takes a coarse scene. For example, every fruit here is just a sphere. And it moves it based on certain physical equations, which we already said are approximate to save a lot of computational resources. And after the physical processing is done, if we want, we can also render the scene into a graphical representation. The work of this rendering module takes quite a bit of time and resources, and it gives us something very precise in terms of, say, glossiness or shades, and so on. And to understand how different these two aspects, physics and graphics, are, we can think of changing the game from throwing an apple at oranges to throwing an orange at apples. In the physical representation, almost nothing changes. It cares about objects' approximate shapes and weight and location and forces and so on. But the rendering, we would basically have to do all over again. There we care about fine-grained shape and texture and all aspects of color and so forth. So in engineered systems, physics and graphics are almost entirely unrelated. The computations are very different and rely on very different properties. And for many purposes, the graphical rendering is totally unnecessary. So there's already a lot of research about the possibility that the physics engine has a mental analog, this approximate physical simulation. And what we claim is that first, we should take seriously also the idea of a division of labor and therefore a separation between physics and graphics for people as well. For things like identification or selection, like apple versus orange or ripe or not, we need precise graphical information like hue. But for many other things like action selection or prediction, throwing an apple and determining where it might land, the graphical aspects do not matter at all. And this distinction between physics and graphics is relevant both bottom up for things like perception or scene interpretation, and top down for imagination or simulation. And what we also argue is that physics is what dominates everyday cognition. So we can do a lot with a physical representation of a scene. As I mentioned, we can make judgments on object properties like velocity or mass. These judgments are, of course, highly relevant for action planning and so on. And we can also work with the physical simulation itself, which provides not only predictions of what might happen next when we move it forward, but also reasoning of what had previously happened if we move the simulation backwards, and causality if we work with counterfactuals, what would have happened if some aspect was different. And we can do tracking as we saw with the pointer system by sort of tagging some part of the simulation. So just like with tracking, our broader claim is that physics is relevant also for things that are not directly associated with physical reasoning in the regular sense. So for example, we argue that physical simulation is enough for things that were previously attributed to visual imagery, which explains many findings from the classic imagery debate, as well as very recent findings from aphantasia, the inability to voluntarily create mental images, a condition that in the past couple of years gained much attention and is currently the target of much theoretical debate. Because in aphantasia, there is a mystery. So people with aphantasia still manage to perform many tasks similarly to people with normal imagery, even things that might sound surprising like mental rotation. And we argue that in aphantasia, only graphical rendering is damaged while the physics, including the simulation, is intact. And we also argue that for most everyday tasks, including so-called imagery tasks, physical representations and simulations are the important bits, while rendering is usually optional and fairly non-consequential. And we think that that's why the internal lives of people with aphantasia are mostly quite similar to the rest of the population. They solve things like mental rotation with physical simulation, but we suggest that that's what all of us actually do. So intuitive physics might be very broadly relevant to our cognition, including in areas we previously thought were completely external to it. And here is the link to the paper if you want to see more. I would be very, very happy to hear any thoughts you might have on this. With that, I just want to thank my collaborators on these projects, the students at my lab, and our funding sources, and of course, you for your attention. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Haleli. This was really great, and I want to invite everybody to unmute yourselves and let's give Haleli a very big applause. It's wonderful.